Welcome to Reel Filmmaking. My name is Corey, and today we're talking about the exposure triangle, or as I'd like to call it, the exposure triforce, for my Zelda fans out there. I see you. I see you. But the exposure triangle is essentially a set of three different pieces that help you to expose an image. And when you're first getting into doing video and photography, but we're specifically talking about video today, this is stuff that's super helpful to understand, and it's very foundational in just building your knowledge of videography. So today I'm going to walk through these three different pieces, particularly again related to video. If you want to learn more about this in relation to photography, there's a lot of great information out there, but they're similar, but they're very different too. So we're talking about exposure triangle in regards to video. So the first big piece that we're going to talk about is aperture. Now, aperture is probably the most complicated of these three. Each lens that you get for your camera has a different number on it. So it might be like a 22mm and it says f2, or you might have a 50mm that says f1.8. Those numbers are talking about how much light the lens can take in, which is a part of what aperture is. Aperture is how much light a lens can take in, and it also is talking about the amount of separation that can be created from that number. Any number that has that letter F in front of it is called an f-stop, or it's telling you how much light the lens can take in. If the number is lower, like f1.4, f1.8, f2, that means that particular lens can take in a ton of light to help expose images. If the number is a little bit higher, let's say you have a zoom lens and maybe it's a variable aperture, that means it changes with the focal length. It might be like f4.5 to f6.3. That means that lens takes in a lot less light in comparison to an f1.4 or an f2 lens. The numbers that are smaller, like f1.8, f2, those are called fast apertures. And so you might hear people say, oh, that's a really fast lens. It means it has a lower f-stop, it can take in more light through its aperture. Whereas a slow lens that has a aperture of like f5.6 or f6.3, that would be a slow lens. It can take in less light, and it's a bigger f-stop number. So that's one piece of what that aperture f-stop number means, but the other part is in regards to something called depth of field. So you may have seen movies or pictures where the subject is in super pin sharp focus and the rest of the image is blurred out, or like it's just blown out, you can't really see it. That is what is called a shallow depth of field. So that is a way of directing your viewer's attention to look at that specific thing. It's very much a creative, artistic choice. It is very popular for certain types of videos and photos, particularly if you're doing like interviews or if you're doing subject photography where you want the audience to really focus on that one thing. It can be a really powerful thing to use a shallow depth of field. So again, this is where these smaller f-stop numbers come into play. If you have a lens that has an aperture of f1.8, f2, you're going to have an easier time achieving the shallow depth of field effect. So even right now, you can see like the background behind me is kind of blurred out, I'm in focus, and I kind of like that. It's not too extreme, but it does pull the focus to me. But even if I just move a couple feet forward, and you can see the background is even a little bit more blurred out, but you can see because I have a lens that is a fast f-stop, I'm able to achieve that effect. On the opposite side, we have a deep depth of field. So that means more of the picture, more of the video is in focus. A time that you would want to do this is maybe if you're a photographer and you're doing landscape photography, you don't want to like set up for a beautiful like sunrise set and maybe you get like one tree that's in focus and like the sunrise and the mountains are out of focus. Like that defeats the purpose of taking the big landscape shot. So having a higher f-stop number like f5.6, f8, f11, f13, depending on the situation, and a lot of these people, if you're shooting outside in landscape photography, you want to close down your aperture again to help control the image and to expose the light correctly. That's going to help you get everything in focus. An instance for wanting to use a deep depth of field in video might be if you're doing like real estate video, where, you know, the realtor or the owner has helped to stage the house and done all these different things. You want to shoot with a wide depth of field in there, because if you don't, you're going to have maybe one chair or one table or something that is like in pin sharp focus, and the rest of the scene is going to be blurred out. And that's not helpful when people are trying to look at houses, through pictures or videos, and they can't see fully what the space looks like. They can't see all the other things. All the hard work that has gone into staging that house is kind of wasted because, the area of focus is like this big when it needs to be like the whole frame. So that's the other big piece of Aperture. Along with controlling how much light comes in through the lens, it also helps to control the depth of field, what you want to put in focus, your foreground versus your background, and how much ability you have to do that. So our next big piece that we want to talk about in our exposure triforce, or triangle actually, is ISO. The easiest way to think of ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So every camera has a sensor. I've got my Canon EOS M here. You can see the sensor in the camera. That sensor takes in all the light. It passes through the lens. We just talked about Aperture, how much light comes in. It controls the depth of field, but then your sensor is where the light actually hits, and that helps you to, the camera to expose the image. ISO in relation to that is how the camera processes all that light. When the ISO is lower, the camera can handle more light. If there is less light in the image, you have to turn up your ISO, and that helps the camera to capture more light. But turning up your ISO comes at a cost. Your camera is creating artificial light, and so that can produce noise or grain in your image. And so if you've ever been shooting out at night and you can't really see and you have to crank up your ISO, and you come back and you look at your footage and you see that it's kind of grainy or flecky, or it has kind of artifacts in it, it's because the ISO had to get turned up so high and there wasn't enough natural light for the sensor to capture. So your camera kind of had to create artificial light, and so that's why you get that noise. On entry-level and intermediate-level cameras, I try to keep my ISO below 1600 on the high side. If I can, I try to keep it below 1000 most of the time, and like I said, bring in more light. Put yourself, whether it's if you're outside shooting, move to a place that has more light. If you're in a studio setting like this or something, bring more light into your scene. That's going to help you expose your image better. It's going to give you a more clean image overall because you can turn the ISO down. The camera is taking in the natural light, and you're just going to get a better looking image overall. And the last piece of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is kind of the set it and forget it setting for filmmakers. It's not exactly like that, but of the three settings, it's probably the one that you will deal with the least. Once you set it up one time, you can usually keep it that way. So an easy way to think of shutter speed is it controls how motion is depicted in your video. So for instance, right now, I'm talking, let's say I'm moving my hands and stuff, there's some natural motion blur to my hands as I'm talking to you, as I move them through the frame. If I turn up the shutter speed and start moving my hands, you can see that it feels really weird. There's less motion blur here. It feels weird. I don't like it. This is weird to look at. So shutter speed controls how motion looks passing through the frame. For video, most of the time, the general rule of thumb is whatever frame rate that you're shooting at, you're going to want to double your shutter speed. So I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, so if I double that, that's 1/48th. And on most cameras, you don't have 1/48th of a second, so the closest thing is 1/50th of a second. Regardless of whatever frame rate you're shooting at, if you're shooting 30 frames per second, or even in slow, 60 frames or 120 frames per second, you always want to double your shutter speed, because again, that's going to keep that natural movement ratio intact, so that way when you're watching back through your footage, it doesn't look weird or unnatural. Of course, this is a general rule. You can obviously change it if you're doing something specific. Maybe you're shooting a horror film and you kind of want some frenetic movement, things look weird or moving in an unnatural way. You would turn up the shutter speed, and that could be a way that you get that effect. Or I've seen also higher shutter speeds used in action movies or even war movies sometimes to convey the very frenetic pace of things happening. And so again, these are creative choices, but generally if you're doing videos on YouTube or just doing standard video production, interviews, talking heads, behind the scenes, all that sort of stuff, you're gonna just set your shutter speed one time and you're not really gonna deal with it ever again. So that's the exposure triangle, or the triforce, if you will. Like I mentioned earlier, as videographers, we mostly have to deal with just aperture, how much light is coming in through our lens, and how to control the depth of field if we want it really deep or if we want it shallow. And ISO, that's going to help us in how much artificial noise the camera is producing versus how much light it's taking in. Those are the main things that we have to deal with. We don't really have to deal with shutter speed. whereas a photographer kind of has to juggle all three of those things. Maybe they do want the image to have a little bit of motion blur to it, or maybe they want it tack sharp, so they have to deal with shutter speed. And every time that you alter one of these things, as you'll see, it affects the other one. So if I'm doing something where I'm shooting with a really wide aperture, I'm taking lots of light in, so I'll probably have to lower my ISO. If I'm shooting with a more closed aperture, like I'm shooting at like f4.5 or something, I'll probably need to turn my ISO up or bring more natural light into the scene. So they all affect each other. It's a triangle because there's always a little bit of give and take. When you alter one thing, it affects the other two. So I hope you find this video helpful in just understanding the basics of the exposure triangle. It can get you going in video production, or maybe even help you understand the exposure triangle in a way that you didn't fully before you watched this. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to Reel Filmmaking for more content, hopefully coming on a weekly basis. I know there was kind of a long hiatus between this last video and the one before, but hopefully on a weekly basis. And until next time, keep making movies and watching movies, and I'll see you on Reel Filmmaking.